I think 40 years ago when I started my career, not only was religious and spiritual functioning ignored, but it was actually attacked. There were very powerful theorists in the field of psychology who even made causal statements that religion and spirituality were the causes of mental illness. And through a lot of work over the years, that has really been shown to not be accurate. In fact, most of the research shows that folks with uh, religious functioning are actually more mentally healthy. There are forms of religiousness that tend to be less healthy. Extrinsic religiosity, where you do it for political purposes or to make contacts for your own advancement, um, tend to not be as healthy. But the strongest predictor is intrinsic religious functioning, in which you pursue your religious functioning or spirituality because it is inherently satisfying to your inner self. It's intrinsically motivated. And as intrinsic religiosity increases, as we see higher levels of intrinsic religiosity, we also see higher levels of mental health. These days, um, there's actually a division in APA that integrates and researches spirituality and mental health. And it is accepted as a viable um, area of full human processing, and ignoring people's religious and spiritual functioning in a lot of ways ignores major parts of who they are, and in some ways does damage to them. And so over 40 years, we've kind of recognized and sorted out what's healthy and what's less healthy, and recognized that it really is a very important part of human functioning. There tends to be a distinction, that people make a distinction between religiosity and spirituality, that religiosity tends to be attached to some kind of organized religion or some kind of organized process for spirituality. Obviously, they can both coexist. You can have a religious process attached to organized religion and have it be deeply spiritual. The definition that I use for spirituality is that spirituality is the consciousness of victory over self and of communion with the infinite. And that certainly can happen within the structures of an organized religion. So they're not opposites. It's just some distinctions that some folks have made in the literature. Well, I think one of the benefits of that definition is that it is ecumenical enough to be very broad, to accept a wide range of people's spiritual processes. And for me, I see within that definition three components of spirituality. One is that it's consciously chosen. It's a consciousness. It's consciously chosen. Victory over self just means, to me, there's a disciplined path. That some things are um, desirable and some things are not. There's a disciplined path, a consciously chosen disciplined path, but that's not enough. There is a third component, which is some kind of communion with something that is much larger than self, communion with the infinite. And in the process of um, accepting and integrating people's spiritual process in psychotherapy is that those issues of a consciously chosen path rather than something that was forced on you or something that's willy-nilly often emerges. Um, issues of um, ethics and right and wrong and good and evil tend to emerge in around questions of the disciplined path. And when people feel something bigger than self helping them along their path, that's also really helpful. And I don't have to define what that is. I can feel it when it happens, and they can feel it when it happens. And I don't have to define it with any particular religious constructs other than, did you feel that? Did you feel something larger than self when we discuss that? And I've had that happens very frequently in the individual psychotherapy that I do, or even the family therapy, that there will be a time when a higher power enters the process and I can feel it and they can feel it. And all I have to say is, did you feel that? And they'll say, yes. How would you define that? What do you think that is? Or if they don't know, I will say, well, for example, that's the feeling that is accompanies love and truth. So what you just said to me about your life, whatever, or what was said in this family session, you could feel as a manifestation of love and truth. And those are part of something that's much bigger than self. And so it just allows that to enter the room rather than dismissing it as this is not important. It is important. And I don't have to define it or lay the construct on it heavily. I just acknowledge it and we allow it to be. That's really legitimate for them to either say, that's not for me, or I have never felt that, or I don't believe. And that's really legitimate, because if you say, well, it's a consciousness of victory over self and of communion with the infinite, and they say there is no infinite, I say, okay, it's totally legitimate. In some of the classes I teach, one of the questions is, what's your history with God? And for somebody who is atheistic, they can say, what history with God? What God? What are you talking about? And that's a legitimate answer. Their history with God is, my history with God is none. Or my history with God, for somebody who's had traumatic experience, say, uh, this has been traumatic for me. The way this was posed to me as a child was traumatic. And so I've rejected that. That is a legitimate history. And we can talk about it either way. No history, rejecting history, accepting history, confusing history. It's all part of at least being open to, this is a domain to be considered. As much as we might consider sexuality or gender issues, this is part, we have to accept this as part of who people are. Now, I do believe that for folks who are in recovery, there is so much embedded in higher power that if somebody has not experienced the infinite, or has not experienced a higher power, or their childhood experience with religion or higher power was corrupted by some abuse, I think it makes it harder for their recovery in a 12-step program. But then again, the same thing is, so let's explore your experience with higher power. Let's explore how these steps are more difficult for you if you don't have, or if you don't trust a higher power. How do you experience the infinite? Is how we'll pose it. How do you experience that? Because people experience it differently on an individual level. It's almost like there's an individual language that the infinite communicates with. Um, how do you experience your higher power? How do you experience the infinite? How do you experience God? Maybe a way to say it. And how do you conceive of God? What's your conception? What conception are you operating on, is this a loving, interested, active force, or is this a neutral, unbiased force that really doesn't care, but still has power? How do you conceive of those three questions? Seem to help this discussion go forward.